Hello class, this is week one, our second video of week one. We'll be doing a little bit of an overview with regard to ethical theory, and we will be covering we will be studying a few links that are on Blackboard, as well as pages 1 through 17 of Judith Voss's book, Analyzing Moral Issues. So when we talk about moral theory, it's important to talk about what philosophy is. Philosophy is the love of wisdom, ethics being a branch of philosophy. So the philosophy, the word came from the ancient Greeks meaning love of wisdom. It's an academic discipline that exercises reason and logic in an attempt to understand reality and answer fundamental questions about who are we, how do we know what we know, the meaning of life, and also issues with regard to morality and human nature. So ethics, being a branch of philosophy, deals with the values relating to human conduct with the respect to the rightness and wrongness of certain actions and to the goodness and badness of the motives and end of such actions. So I have a link on week one, our week one content folder, that says what is ethics. This gives a really good overview of what ethics really is. So definitely read that. We also have some explanation, of course, in Voss's book as well. So a little bit further about the definition of ethics. It's a branch of philosophy that specifically deals with morality, distinguishing between good and evil in the world, distinguishing between right and wrong human actions, virtuous and non-virtuous behavior. And that's we'll be studying that throughout this semester, particularly the next 2 weeks. Also, ethics also entails the study of rules within an organization, such as the medical field, the legal field, a certain code of conduct of right and proper behavior. So that's also a part of ethics, not from a philosophical standpoint, but from an institutional standpoint with regard to certain organizations and fields such as medical and legal fields, etc. So why is it important to study ethics? Why am I taking this class? Why is this required for me? Many of you may be asking this question, and I'm going to answer that for you. So it's important to study ethics because ethics education helps us to articulate moral values and apply moral theory and moral reasoning to particular issues and real-life moral decisions. So oftentimes we have an idea of what might be right and wrong, but we don't know how to articulate why it is right or wrong. Studying moral theory will help us to articulate why a certain action is right, why a certain action is wrong, why a certain policy is right, why a certain policy is wrong, and to do it objectively, not based on just our feelings or what we think, right? This will help us to look at it from an objective basis based on reason, the use of reason. Ethics is also important because it helps us to motivate us to act on our beliefs to help alleviate suffering of others, speak out against injustices, take actions to correct injustices, and it helps us to be the best people we can be. Studying ethics can help us to be more likely to do the right thing instead of the wrong thing. Before we go further with regard to the study of ethics, in our book we have a list of common logical fallacies that we may engage in when trying to argue the rightness or wrongness of a situation. There are a list of them, but I wanted to alert you to a few that are important. So in our week one folder, there's a folder called Informal Fallacies. If you click on them, there's 3 links with regard to 3 of the most common logical fallacies that we might use when arguing with something's right or wrong. The first one is called the naturalistic, or the is-ought fallacy. What this holds is that we determine the morality of something, of what ought to be, based on what is now. We make this fallacy based on the assumption that because something is not now occurring, it should not occur, or because something is occurring now, that's the way it ought to be, right? This is not a good argument to make, because sometimes just the way something is instituted or something is the way it is does not mean that's the way it ought to be, right? And we can think about things in our history such as slavery as an example of that, right? The next logical informal fallacy that we have is called the popular appeal fallacy. It's called the bandwagon fallacy. and it's also in Latin called argumentum ad populum. And this fallacy holds that just because something is popular does not mean that it's right. For an example, if we cite a study that says 85% of Americans believe that capital punishment is morally justified, that in and of itself, just because the majority of people believe something is ethical, does not make it ethical. We have to base it on not just on popular appeal or what the majority of people think is right. We have to base it on like objective ethical standards. So the next fallacy that we have is called the appeal to tradition fallacy, and this fallacy is kind of akin to the naturalistic fallacy, wherein we use something that has been long-standing in history as a basis of arguing that this is morally right, that tradition is morally right. Just because something has been passed down from generation to generation, that makes it morally right. This is not correct. This is not necessarily so. Just because we've been doing something for so long does not mean that we ought to keep on doing something. So this is one fallacy we also want to try to avoid. And our book has more, but those are the three that I wanted to concentrate on because they're probably the most common ones that we make. So back to moral philosophy. The branch of moral philosophy, the subdivision of moral philosophy we'll be studying is normative ethics. We'll be studying basically the moral theories, moral issues that we're confronted with, but based on moral theory. And so we're going to take that further and use applied ethics, which applied ethics is applying these normative guidelines, these moral theories to specific moral dilemmas, as we'll see throughout this semester. So what makes a good moral theory? A good moral theory, well, first of all, we have to define what theory is. That's a conceptual framework for explaining a set of facts or concepts. So moral theory explains why a certain action is right or wrong and why we ought to act in a certain way and be a certain type of person. For a moral theory to be a good moral theory, it has to be universal and impartial. It should apply equally to everyone in the same or similar circumstances. This is what we strive for. We run into trouble when we use relativistic theories, and our book explains two types of relativistic theories: ethical relativism and cultural relativism. Ethical relativism is where morality is created by people. Ethical subjectivism. As the individual people create their own morality, there are no objective or universal moral truths. Just because I believe something is right, that means it's right for me. That is not a good way in which we should determine if something is ethical or not. Just because I believe something is ethical does not make it so. Just because I believe something's right for me does not make it morally right. So we should strive not to use that as a proper ethical theory because it's not proper. The next one, the ethical relativistic theory that sometimes we use is cultural relativism, wherein the societal norms become the basis of morality. Moral values are nothing more than cultural customs and traditions and laws. So the moral values of one culture cannot be judged as any better or worse than any other culture. It's society believes something is right, then it is right. And that is not a good basis by which judging if a certain policy or practice within a society is morally right or not. This is kind of akin along the lines of the naturalistic fallacy, basing what ought to be based on what is. And so this is not a good basis by which we should argue that something is moral. Just because something is legal or culturally acceptable does not mean it's morally acceptable. Just because there's a law about something does not mean it's morally right. Just because cultural values say something is right does not make it morally right. So there's problems with that. We need to try to analyze things using reason and logic and make it as universal as possible. Some other important terms that we will discover are moral community. Moral community is basically those people who are deemed as having moral value and whom we are obligated to help. So, who our moral community may be very small, it could be like our family or neighbors, etc. It could be very expansive, like everyone in the world, the universe, etc. So basically, who we deemed we're morally obligated to help, that's our moral community. Another important term which we will come into contact, particularly when we discuss abortion, is the idea of persons. This isn't human beings necessarily, but persons are beings who have moral worth. So if we grant a being personhood, say for instance in the example of abortion, if we grant the fetus personhood, then that's a being to which we have obligations to help. That's a being that has moral worth. We can extend personhood to animals as well and say that these are beings that have moral worth and therefore have rights that should be respected. So the idea of personhood becomes very important in ethical theory. Some other things to which the book does not speak of that much that are important are ethical principles and ethical codes. We have two links in our content folder for week 1. One is on ethical principles and one is on ethical rules and codes. If you go to your week 1 links to read, there's a link of certain ethical principles. About halfway down the page, you'll see ethical principles such as respecting autonomy, someone's right to do with themselves as they wish, non-maleficence, doing no harm, not causing harm in our actions, beneficence, benefiting others, which means actively promoting the well-being of others, the principle of justice, which we will encounter when we talk about rights-based ethics, and the principle of fidelity, or being faithful, being loyal, truthful to one another, sticking by our word, sticking by our promises. Those are some examples of ethical principles. Another link that you'll see there is codes of ethics and ethical rules. This is a good link with regard to certain sets of principles used by companies, professional organizations, and individuals to govern their decision making and choosing between right and wrong. So those two links are important. We also have a couple terms that are important with regard to religion. This is not a religious ethics class, but there are two things that are important that deserve mentioning. One, and here's another argument that we will not be using, is the divine command theory. In this class, we will not be using this because it is subjective and it is based on dogma rather than reason and logic. Divine command theory says that something is moral just because God approves it. So morality is relative to what God commands or wills. That's not really universal, and it's based on what a particular religion states. Natural law theory is another aspect of religious-based morality, wherein God commands something because it is moral, not the other way around. So morality is grounded in rational human nature rather than God's commands, personal feelings or cultural norms, and it should be universally binding. So that, if you think about Martin Luther King, he argued from natural law theory. So did Thomas Aquinas, basically discussing, in Martin Luther King Jr.'s case, discussing the immorality of Jim Crow. That would be one example. But we want to stray away from religious arguments when making arguments with regard to morality, because they're dogmatic and they're not universal. However, there are some principles embedded in religious practices and religious beliefs that may have moral value and moral worth when arguing certain things, and we'll encounter that as we encounter that. So that is it for your lecture for today. Follow the directions on the assignments, and if you need me, please give me a holler. Thank you very much, and see you next week. Bye.